Hey folks, a really quick lecture here on postmodernism and touching upon some ideas like critical race theory and feminism, but trying to more broadly tackle this range of ideas that we might label as postmodern. It's really a difficult thing to understand, and frankly, this is the most challenging sort of subject matter for myself. Um, and yet, hopefully, in the course of this lecture, it'll become clear why people who we might label as postmodern theorists themselves would fully expect and embrace the idea that their theories should be difficult to read and think about and discuss. And I call it here sort of a turn to language in the history of political theory, and that is, that's probably too narrow of a way to think about postmodernism, particularly since it's an approach that we see in art. What ironically what we sometimes call modern art, but the move away from specific identifiable types of form and structure and such, and the breaking of rules in art, in film, in poetry, in English and literary theory, all of these areas in addition to philosophy and political theory. But I call it the turn to language here in this sort of title is because at its heart, this area of thinking sort of looks at the way our concepts and our ideas themselves are confining and constraining, and therefore contain sort of structures of power within the very way that we speak and think and talk. And again, right, of course, if that's the case, then speaking, thinking, talking, reading, writing about these topics is going to be difficult because the subject matter is sort of self-constraining. I know that sounds crazy. Hopefully, it'll make more sense as we move along here. Right. So just to clarify, we've been talking about modern political philosophy, and sometimes we as we move into the 20th century, we start talking about contemporary political philosophy, although that's sort of a weird label because contemporary always sounds like right now. And, in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, the things that were contemporary shift into the modern or maybe the postmodern phase. I mean, the way we talk about these and classify these different theories is funny. It's kind of like when I put on the 104.3 in New York, the radio station that I grew up listening to as classic rock, and now I hear Nirvana and Pearl Jam on it, and I'm like, what? Like, no, that's alternative rock. And it's like, no, not anymore. Now it's classic rock. So some of these boundaries get a little bit like that. But I think it's worth noting that in terms of modernity, a lot of our modern political thought ends up being for very good reasons, for reasons of their relevance to politics, a battle both within sort of the liberal tradition, the Lockean tradition, Locke, Kant, to some extent Bentham, Rawls and the Rawlsians in the mid 20th century are in many respects a response to the dominance of utilitarian philosophy and a lot of maximizing public welfare kind of philosophy of politics and governance. That's all within the liberal tradition of thought. And then the main challenger is, of course, the leftist tradition, the Marxist tradition. And so, in the moderns, we dealt with a lot of moderns, but and this is not to displace Hobbes and Rousseau and Mill and all these people. Mill, good liberal, but the Lockean and the Marxian kind of the liberal and the Marxist traditions are the dominant ones, and they each, I think, importantly, seek a type of sort of scientific truth about the world. This is the way the world is. This is how we know the world. And right, the idea of progress and sort of building a scientific understanding of human nature and society and the appropriate form of politics is part and parcel of the modern approach. And both of these, even though they're very different, the Lockean, the Marxian approach, Marxist approach, are both reaching for this type of truth, which we associate with modernity, and their followers to some extent are in the contemporary 20th century or 21st century even, but these are our 20th century philosophers I'm talking about here, Rawls and Nozick battling over the meaning of liberalism. People like the Italian philosopher Gramsci and the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, Adorno, people more sort of German continental philosophers, all these people fighting over the meaning of Marx in the 20th century, essentially this idea of, well, the revolution didn't happen. What does Marx mean in terms of sort of cultural Marxism without this historical materialism? The revolution is inevitable, the process of history. A lot of 20th century Marxism rejuvenates these ideas of sort of the power and the strength of ideology and its ability to prevent the movement on past capitalism, the strength of capitalist ideology, essentially, and the need to do more if we're to move past it is sort of a running theme here in 20th century Marxism. But importantly, again, these philosophers here are in the 20th century sort of carrying on the modern battles of the liberals, liberals all the way from the libertarians to some sort of democratic socialists within the liberal camp, and then the left from the sort of democratic socialists all the way over to the communists, the Marxists, the true Marxists are all sort of fighting in this vein of what is the truth. But alongside that, at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, we get a bunch of philosophers who start to reject this idea of truth. That there is a way, an objective way to understand the world, and we just have to find it. A lot of them start to, a lot of the sort of prominent ones that we would consider to be transitional into postmodernism or early postmodernists themselves, start focusing on that. And you get people like Soren Kierkegaard, who you guys probably haven't heard of. He's a very eccentric, esoteric kind of thinker. But I always associate him in my mind with this idea that meaning in life is somehow divergent from reason. And he was a Christian philosopher and an early sort of Christian existentialist, and believed that meaning was associated with sort of the embrace of an idea that you truly will, that you truly choose for yourself, as opposed to because society or norms or reason tell us to. And so his most famous, or at least for me, his most impactful story is this idea that of Abraham and true faith in the story of Abraham and Isaac comes only because Abraham, when God tells him, kill your one beloved only son that you've waited your whole life for, Abraham is willing to reject everything he understands about the world and embrace this idea that is, true devotion to his faith is to climb up on the mountain and kill his son. And when everything tells him that that's wrong, but he has this faith, he makes this leap of faith. These ideas. Kierkegaard's very difficult to understand. I took a course in college in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, taught by a Heidegger expert, and it was trippy and fun and challenging. But it's always difficult for me to reach back and pick up strands of that. But Kierkegaard really, challenged this idea that we could find meaning through reason. Nietzsche, which you guys probably have heard of Nietzsche, is famous for ideas like genealogy, the idea that if you trace back any ethic or idea or political understanding of the world, you can find sort of the historical development of where those ideas come from, and it's not some objective truth. It's sort of a cultural historical process that develops ideas, and so it's going to be associated with the idea we'll talk about on the next slide of deconstruction. That all of the ideas in society that we think are important and natural are in fact social constructs, and that we can figure out the way power develops those constructs and ideas of good and evil. And so he's associated with nihilism because he deconstructs. He finds the genealogy, the development of all of these ideas, including religious ideas and ideas of justice, and finds that none of them are true or objective, and what's left after that, right? And he's also associated with this idea of the will to power. Well, again, kind of like Kierkegaard, and this is why I think that they were taught together when I took this course. Well, if there isn't any sort of objective meaning that we can just reach out and find, we have to make it ourselves. And so he has this idea that the truly, the will to power, the Übermensch, the truly great individual in history will stand above all of the masses and make meaning, right, for society. Right, and it will be a construction of power. It's always a construction of power. These ideas or the things that we value in society. But he's toying with this idea of how could we do it in a better way, a way that produced more meaning. So again, you can see these people playing around already with this idea that there isn't some objective, true meaning that we can find out in the world. Wittgenstein is associated with ideas of language games, syntax as important, and some of these are theorists that I don't know particularly well, that I've struggled with myself, which again I think is appropriate. It's very difficult to kind of casually dip into these people, but for me, Wittgenstein, who's kind of an eclectic thinker as well, is associated with this idea of again, it's not just like culture and norms that constrain the way we view the world, but it's the very language in which we think about the world itself. And he talks a lot about syntax and the way that nouns and verbs and ways of thinking and writing and speaking limit our opportunities to think about the world we encounter, and how he's fighting in part these ideas like Platonic forms and ancient Greek sort of ideas of a true way of being or a true idea, a true form, as Plato would say, and no. Wittgenstein says it's more shaped and contingent than that. And again, this is difficult to follow, but difficult for me to follow. But Wittgenstein I associate with this idea of how we are linguistic creatures and how language shapes the way we view the world. The idea that when we think about a tree or when we think about justice, these words, tree, justice, mediate our ideas, our way to experience the world. And then Heidegger, who you guys may have heard of, I got my copy of Being in Time here. Man, this is difficult stuff. And by the way, the only graduate class I ever dropped was a class on Heidegger. For I can't remember if I dropped it because it was just too difficult. I think I dropped it because it didn't fit into my schedule very well. But I like to think that. But it was, man, those first week or two of Heidegger was some heavy stuff. And Heidegger is associated with this idea of phenomenology, and essentially this sort of builds on this idea that language is inadequate for us to really describe our experience of the world. And so every time we try to think or write or express our feelings about ourselves, about the world, we're forced once again back into boxes and boxes of ways to think about the world that don't truly capture all of the richness and all of the multiplicity and all the individuality, right? My experience of we might say my experience of looking at something red and your experience of looking at something red. Oh, it's red. It's red. That doesn't really capture the experience of looking, perceiving something that is red. And again, you can apply this to more important concepts than art and color and things like that. But the idea that our perceptions and that when we put them into boxes to explain things to ourselves and to others, that it always constricts the meaning of the terms that we're using. And by the way, I'll get to this comic strip on the side, perhaps in my next my next one when I get to this idea of postmodernism itself. Right. All right. So. I got to move my face here. So there's this Simpsons episode where Moe redoes his bar and he makes it into this fancy kind of super hipster bar, and it's got weird stuff. It's got, these TVs on that have like glowing eyes, and his friends Homer and the guys come in and they're like, "Can you put on the game?" And he's like, "Nah, that's for the eye." And they're like, "Why?" And he's like, "It's Pomo." And they're like, "We don't understand. What does that mean?" He's like, "It's postmodern." And they're like, we don't get it. And he's like, "Yeah, it's weird for the sake of being weird." And that it's like a joke about postmodernism, that postmodern things are weird for the sake of being weird. They buck norms and trends and ways of normally doing things. And that's like actually a pretty good description. And really what, the idea of postmodern critique and deconstruction, as we'll get into in this slide, is that the things that you think are the natural, right, objective way of doing things, of viewing the world, of categorizing the things in the world, they're not. They're contingent, and I'll do things another way, and it's going to seem bizarre to you. And it's not that the way that I'm doing it is right or good or makes more sense necessarily. It might not. It might be more useful or less useful, but that by doing things or acting in a way or speaking in a way or expressing myself in a way that doesn't fit the norms, the customs, the linguistic standards that everyone's used to, I disrupt them. I show that there's another way of doing things, and that the way that everyone is used to doing things and thinking about things and talking about things is not some natural way, right? So we've talked about this in terms of things like race, where if we started using racial concepts differently, it would be disruptive to people because we know what the races are: white, black, Asian, Latino. These are the races, and it's like, well, no, I'll use different ones, and you can't, and people would say you can't do that. And now it's not that, again, if I started using 12 races and organized them differently, that those would be real, that I would have constructed a objectively true idea of race. It would be that I would be showing there is no objectively true idea of race, right? And then I would spring from that to say, and the ideas of race that you're using right now, that we're all using, whose interests are those serving, right? And whose interests are being exploited? Whose life in this world is being made more difficult by those concepts, right? That's sort of the ideally liberatory concept of postmodernism. So I just, there are a million definitions of postmodernism, particularly because it's a concept that's used a lot outside of philosophy and political theory, particularly with literary criticism and with art and art criticism. So this is what I'm using, right? So it's a rejection of objective truth, right? The modern commitment to finding objective truth. It's a rejection to the idea that there's objective truth out there. And it focuses on language, culture, and ideology and how those constrain the way we see the world, right? Trying to show the ways in which the structures of thought that we have constrain us in ways that are not as good as possibly other ways of looking at the world. So central to this idea of postmodernism is the idea that I've mentioned already of deconstruction. Right? If we identify the norms, the concepts, the ideas that society views as objective and natural, and then we demonstrate the ways in which they're contingent social constructs. We use genealogy. We show that where the ideas came from. We show other ways that they could be interpreted. We show different alternatives. That we deconstruct the naturalness of those ideas. We show them not to be objective truths, but to be things that we made, that we constructed as a society. And then we move from there and ask, well, who is empowered, who is helped by these constructs as they are constructed, and who is limited, who is constrained, who is hurt, who doesn't fit into the world as it's constructed, and who is the world constructed for? Who does it, So that's a similar idea to what we encountered in Marxism. But with Marxism, there's a truth. There's an idea that the world is always constructed. The ideologies are always constructed to paper over the truth of human solidarity. Right? There's one truly human way of living in this world, and as a creative social being, and the ideologies are always constructed in ways that reinforce the capitalist domination of society. Hello. I don't know who's here. Right. So in the Marxist tradition, you're using genealogy, you're sort of using deconstruction, but it's to unearth a truth. For a postmodernist, you're using deconstruction. There's no there. You deconstruct and you deconstruct. And one of the ideas is after you do that, the mind and society and the structures of power are always constructing new realities, and those new realities are never true, and they always enforce power in certain ways. And so deconstruction is a process. It's something that you apply to the world you find. It's never something that produces a truth on its own. And I think that, by the way, this is a major criticism, not necessarily of postmodernism, but of the way that postmodernism is employed. As postmodernism has become more and more prominent as a political theory, as a philosophy, it is at its essence a criticism. It is a process of that is applied to the world. And so sometimes it gets very unbalanced when it's the only thing that's being taught, because if you're not doing modernism, if you're not learning and attempting to construct ideas of how the world works and looks, right? Things like dealing with Marxism, dealing with liberalism, then the application of postmodernism feels empty. You apply it to itself, right? Like what does that mean? The lack of construction, the rejection of the idea that construction is something that we can do, finding truth, can leave it a little hollow. And I tend to think that postmodernism, in all its forms, is a nice balance. It unearths the problems and the oppressive structures within our search for truth. But I don't know that for me at least, that it replaces our search for truth. So again, these ideas, that we are deconstructing. What do we mean by order? What do we mean by peace? All the things that we've dealt with so far in this class and in modernism. What do we mean by liberty or freedom? What do we mean by property? What do we mean by consent? Race, gender, sex, disability, sanity. Foucault famously, one of his objects are things like sexuality, like madness and mental health. What does it mean to be sane? What does it mean to be normal? Foucault would famously probably have gone after something like our evolving diagnostic and statistical manual, where we classify, okay, well, now you have autism, now you have ADHD, because we've decided that that's the box that these various symptoms fit into, and that is a way to put things into boxes that we consider to be useful in the world. But the postmodernist or the poststructuralist would say, whose interest do those boxes serve? Are we sure we want those boxes to seem like they're natural, like they're real, like autism, right? My boy has autism, like it's a thing, and that people naturally fit into that box, as opposed to there are just a lot of people out here, and we make sense of similarities and comparisons in ways that we find useful. But who is we, and why is it useful? And is it really in everyone's interests? So the ideas, the very ideas of power and what is natural, what is essential to the very stuff that we've been dealing with throughout modernism, all of that, the postmodernists want to say, not so fast, not so fast. Those very core ideas that you're using. And by the way, I see this in a lot of your papers. When you guys write papers and you use words like fairness and justice as if they have meanings, other than the ones that we give to them, that they're like objective things that everyone understands the same. They are not. That's a very sort of, that whole define your terms kind of way of looking at academic ideas, is not just postmodern. But postmodernism takes that to an extreme, right? It's the annoying kid that asks his parents, well, why? Well, why? Well, what do you mean, right? There's always another question you can ask. And, the postmodernists, they're infuriating, they're frustrating, because they in the end get us all to say, because I said so, that's why, right? And then they think like, yep, I got you. There is no core reason at the end. And as I noted with Rawls in his book, um, Political Liberalism, which I don't know where my political liberalism is. I thought I had it sitting around here somewhere. He, in the end, says, yeah, all right, I agree, right? There is no metaphysical justification for liberalism. It's not right, but everyone agrees to it. Right, everyone. It's a starting point that we can act as if it's a metaphysical agreement. We're going to use this concept of overlapping consensus to get around the idea that there is no why at the end of why should we consider each other as free and equal democratic citizens. He says, well, just because we do. Right, and so in a sense, that's an end to, or that's a postmodern win against the liberals. But on the other sense, right, the Rawls says, fine, like, I'll give that to you. Now let's get constructing again. Let's figure out what our rights should be. All right. So one of the ironies of postmodernism is that almost everyone who is labeled as a postmodernist would not call themselves a postmodernist. It's a way to think about different philosophers and different thinkers. That helps us sort of organize them. And so, and there's also this other term, poststructuralist, that, deals less with language, but both of them are these ideas that there are no natural, ways of understanding the world. And, I don't know, maybe Foucault would be more of a post-structuralist because he's looking less at language and more at, sort of institutions of knowledge. And anyway, but you'll hear these terms used largely interchangeably, and rarely do the philosophers who are placed under these, the political thinkers who are placed under these categories, use that as a description of themselves. So that's a disclaimer there. And again, right, these critical race theorists would not necessarily be considered postmodernists, but it's in the same sort of ballpark. So I'm putting them in here in case I don't get another video up. Foucault is pretty well known to some of you guys. You guys may have heard of Discipline and Punish, or his histories. He writes histories, right, in that sort of genealogy kind of sense, like Nietzsche, histories of sexuality, of madness. These are some of his big books of discipline and of prison systems and things like that. And what Foucault's big point is here, and maybe I should be teaching Foucault. I don't know. Maybe that's something you guys would like to learn more about. But one of the reasons why we pay attention to him in the social sciences is because he points out that systems of knowledge are structures of power. They are the big ways that we think about the world, and we assume them, again, there to be a objectivity to social and natural sciences, and yet the ways in which we produce knowledge inherently, Foucault thinks, structure our ways of thinking in ways that serve the power interests that be. And Foucault's a bit pessimistic about this, and even goes so far as to say that that basically we're kind of done for. You can never get out from under the thumb of power because it's in your head. It's the sort of, what do we do if power, if the power structures are in our very mind? How do we get out of that? Is sort of one of the things that postmodernism struggles with. And Foucault is maybe best known for, at the beginning of Discipline and Punishment, for talking about the panopticon, a design for prisons that Jeremy Bentham came up with. And the idea behind the panopticon is that you have a circular structure in which you have a couple of guards who can view into every prison cell in the whole building. And you could think about it today with hidden cameras, or the way everyone's on cell phone or being recorded, being viewed at any given time, the way social media puts us on view. And this idea of are people watching me? What are they thinking about me? What are they going to do to me? That you don't have to come in and physically dominate people to get them to do what you want, because you get into their head and they start policing themselves. They start internalizing the ideas of the people they see as watching them. And I think that makes a lot of sense to you guys in terms of things like social media. You start living your lives with a mind towards, how will this look? And Foucault says exactly, right? Our ideas of what is sane and what is insane, what is good and what is bad, what is just and unjust, what is what is chaste and pure, and what is deviant and perverse. That all of these ideas, backed up by psychological theories, backed up by philosophical theories, and backed up by hard biological science and things like that, they all serve to get in our heads and make us think that there are right and wrong ways to act, and those ways inevitably serve the powerful. Right, so that's a Foucaultian sort of view of the world. Derrida, very famous. Right, so Foucault up here at top, Derrida right here. Looking very Derrida-ish, is most directly associated with this idea of deconstruction of concepts and of language, and particularly the application of deconstruction to binaries and hierarchies, right? So this or that thinking in the world, good and evil, just and unjust, peace and war, that Derrida says that we tend to structure things. It's sort of the way our minds work. And it's the way language tends to work. We tend to structure things into this or that. It's usually one or the other, or maybe there are a few categories. And we tend to put those categories often into hierarchies, right and wrong, good and bad. Think about the way Aristotle structured the world, right? There's the rule by the many, the few, the one, and there's the good version of it and the bad version of it. And it puts it into boxes. Yeah, we do that in social sciences a lot. We do that in the natural sciences too, right? Where we have to choose what our variables are going to be. And so the way we choose those categories, Derrida is very critical of that. He wants to deconstruct those categories and show that they hide much more diversity and variation than we normally would think. And Judith Butler here, right? And there's Judith Butler down here, applies this specifically. She is one of the best and most successful examples, practical examples, perhaps, of postmodernism. Applied to many topics, right? We don't want to pigeonhole her, but gender, sex, sexuality are sort of her wheelhouse, and this idea of most easily that man and woman are gender constructs and what they mean, including who you're attracted to and what the boundaries of attraction, the boundaries of how you dress, how you talk, how you carry yourself from the world, that we put those into categories of feminine and masculine and things like that, and that hides and constrains the great majority of infinite possibilities of ways to live in the world. And so she's often associated with being as being sort of a queer theorist, saying that much like Kimberly Crenshaw will be associated with intersectional Black feminism, Butler is often associated with postmodern queer feminism, saying that are not lesbians women too? Just because if you're to define feminism and the struggle of women as a struggle of equality and security in the relationship to men, who you have romantic or physical or familial partnerships with, where does that leave women who have relationships and attractions with women? Right, they're left out of your structures of what it is to be a man, is to potentially have a relationship with a woman, of a woman to have a relationship with a man. She says that kind of thinking doesn't create the space that's necessary for someone who doesn't fit into those boxes to live comfortably in the world. Now, Butler, like Foucault and Derrida, who she draws on, thinks that it's these structures, these languages, the ways in which we express ourselves are so dominant, right? I mean, I talk about in class typically that when I was growing up, we didn't have language for widely for ideas like being transgender or non-binary, and it was in fact difficult to think about those ideas. If someone were to come up to you and say, "I'm not a man or a woman," you would not have 20, 30 years ago been able to understand what they are saying, and therefore there would be a limitation of your ability to think with and adjust to and enter into discourse on those ideas, the ways that the concepts that we have, the binaries we have, the structures of language and thought that we have kind of prevent us from considering a lot of different possibilities and a lot of different ways of living. And she says, well, what are you going to do about that? How do you fight language if it's in your head? How do you fight language if you can't communicate to other people, right? I talk about this with social construction all the time. I use the example of race. Well, I'm going to use 12 races instead of 5 races. You can't make yourself understood to people in America when you're talking about race unless you use the races that people that the vast majority of people understands, right? So language is constraining because it's not something you can change on your own. It's something that A is binding in your mind, but B, even as you try to break out of that, it's difficult to make yourself understood and known. Again, one of the reasons why all of these people write in ways that are very difficult to understand is because they're trying to break out of the structures of language and the concepts that we're familiar with. How do you fight the concepts that you're using to explain yourself? That's a tough one. And Butler is known for the idea that our performance, the way we move through the world, the way we make ourselves understood, and create identity and meaning for ourselves using the ideas and the language that exists in the world, recreates those ideas. So, very, very clearly in terms of gender, when every time a woman puts on traditional makeup, they perform what it means to be a woman, and in that performance, they continue to construct and reconstruct the idea of what it means in society to be a woman, to be feminine, is to be someone who wears makeup and has a certain look, wears dresses, walks through and exists in the world in certain ways. Every time you perform those ideas, you recreate them for other people and for the next generation of people, because those are, again, the ideas that continue to make sense of the world for people, and they get passed on. So her sort of solution, and she gets panned for this from Martha Nussbaum, who we read, is, well, how you're going to make change in the world is you're going to parody these things. Men are going to wear high-heeled shoes. Straight men will. Straight women will cut their hair short and not wear makeup. That you defy the norms and the categories, so that people are like, huh? I don't understand. The world is not making sense in terms of the traditional categories that I understand. And it makes them less sure. It disrupts those categories. And, I think that we understand that there is a case to be made that by loosening up, we have not certainly eliminated gender norms, but by loosening them up and who can be a man or a woman in what ways, we create extra space for the woman who wants to wear more masculine clothes, and the man who wants to care for children, right? Parenting, fathering is central to my life, and I do it in ways that maybe might not have been considered acceptably masculine in previous generations. So as we sort of create this elbow room in these concepts, we create spaces for us to live and to express ourselves in more authentic, comfortable ways. And that's really all that you can hope for Judith Butler. Maybe you can take that Butlerian stance and say, well, let's move beyond that. And once we get that elbow room, people who don't fit into the traditional categories of the world will have more voice and be more accepted and have more power, and they can use that as a leverage point, as a jumping off point to get more physical, tangible resources and rights, and the kinds of things that Martha Nussbaum, in her criticism of Butler, is all about. But I will note that Martha Nussbaum is a good modernist in that she is sort of a blend of. She also she's famous actually for being one of the big Aristotle scholars earlier in her career. She was she was my master's thesis advisor at the University of Chicago, so I'm pretty familiar with her. A bunch of her books here, and Martha Nussbaum, the scariest person I've ever met. Intellect like I've never encountered anywhere else, and it's just so intimidating. But brilliant scholar. Anyway, so she, as her career has developed, she's actually a very important Rawlsian scholar, and does the intro of, I guess her intro is in the new version of, or the newest edition of Political Liberalism, his second big book. But anyway, right? So she's a good Rawlsian liberal, but she also is a bit of a Marxist in her thinking about true human flourishing. I like her version of liberalism. It's called the capabilities approach quite a bit. Sort of blends all of these elements together, but they're all very modern elements in the sense of let's find the best ways of living for people and secure them the rights and the ability and the resources to live that way. And so her critique of this sort of let's parody and let's perform in ways that give us that let us live out our identities in ways that are more satisfying and free and don't feel forced upon us. She's like, well, people are starving, and they don't have health care, and they don't have they don't in other countries, particularly in the developing world, they don't have water and food. They're subject to violence. People in America are subject to violence, right? Like these are tangible things that, yes, we might think about them in terms of fundamental human rights, which is a very modern concept. But let's keep doing that, right? Because that's in fact more useful than disrupting categories like fundamental human rights, right? For the sake of deconstructing them. Let's not be weird for the sake of being weird in terms of the most useful categories. And I think that that's, sort of where a lot of this debate comes down to, is that the postmodernists, they don't claim that there are truths in terms of categories. They claim that, categories and language and concepts are more or less useful. And a fundamental, I think, compelling part of their claim is that binaries, things that structure the world in very clear, black and white, well-defined ways, inevitably cause a lot of damage to the people who don't fit into those categories very well. At the same time, people like Nussbaum say, but yes, there is a lot of power in those categories, and that power can be harnessed by large groups of people who don't fit well into, or who are not, being treated equally under our concepts and structures. So feminism, the idea of a movement of women acting collectively. Well, right? Butler says, well, what does it mean to be a woman? And Nussbaum says, shut up, who cares, right? Like if you're in the group, you need to be protected against domestic violence. That's all we're going to do. You need to be given employment protections so that you can't be fired for being in that group, right? Let's not blow up the group. Let's use the group to create legal and political protections. And that's sort of where a lot of the conflict, and where the real critique, right? So Nussbaum calling Butler a kind of hip quietism, being complacent when there's real suffering in the world, is sort of a liberal and to some extent a Marxist reaction to this focus on language and on culture and on performance. It's a let's return to resources and rights kind of approach. All right, and so then we've got the critical race theorists here. Again, none of them really go around asserting that they went around asserting themselves as critical race theorists. Frantz Fanon here, who we read, I have my black skin, white mask, and his other book, The Wretched of the Earth. He is associated again with this idea that language and the psychology of sort of universal structures does damage to colonized peoples and black people who don't fit into the universals, that they're put in these terrible sort of places of having sort of dissonance in their identities and their understanding of the world that is inevitably destructive. But he also is not postmodern in the sense that he does tend to think that power and hierarchy and material hierarchy generates these kinds of ideologies of race and racism. Similarly, for Derek Bell, who's here, who we read his Space Traders story, and for Kimberly Crenshaw, who's associated with the idea of intersectionality. And I put them all in here, and they fit a little bit uncomfortably in this. They actually have a lot of each of them a lot of sympathy and association with Marxist thought, in the sense that they think that race is beyond all the many, many categories out there and concepts that structure our world in ways that help some people and hurt other people. They think that the social construction of race is embedded as a central sort of idea that structures all of our institutions and all of our concepts and all of our ideas of property and justice and all those terms that I had on the last page. They think that race is implicated in all of them, and it's one of the things that makes them all tick. And so they're looking, when they're doing genealogy, when they're doing deconstruction, when they're looking through history and they're looking through our institutions and our ideas, they're looking for where is race at work and where is it advantaging some people and disadvantaging others. And so again, it's like Marx and the Marxists are looking for the ways in which class interest is structuring all of our concepts and our theories. And the critical race theorists are applying that to race. There are feminist theorists out there too, right? People like, hey, here's my Nancy Hartsock, Money, Sex, and Power, who's a Marxist feminist who says that gender alongside class structures all of our interpretations of the world. And so the Marxists, again, think that there is one thing, right? Class, and everything else is sort of a meta-phenomenon coming out of class. The feminists in the Marxist camp say, well, no, class and gender. And the critical race theorists say, well, class and maybe gender, but definitely race, right? So someone like Kimberly Crenshaw would say class and race and gender. The other folks here, the other critical race theorists here, are thinking more about race as sort of the dominant other category, or even the dominant category beyond class, right? It may structure class. It may be the principal idea that, or system of ideas that structures our world. All right. This went on way longer than I thought it would, but interesting stuff, right? Interesting stuff, difficult stuff. Thanks for sticking with me. All right, goodbye.